This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
And I've never read Das Kapital deep into the night, but I'll always know my left side from my right. I'll always know my left side from my right.
Hi, everybody. Tom asked me to project. This is my theatre voice, and this is Serious Danger.
That's good, see? Sue me for wanting women to speak up louder. That's just who I am. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Thank you for seeing me, Tom, and hearing me.
What? You're welcome. Welcome, everyone. This is Serious Danger, a podcast about Greens politics in Australia. It's not an official Greens Party podcast. It's produced by our dear friend, Michael the Griffin, Tom Ballard here on Wurundjeri country in Kulin, on the Kulin Nation in Naarm, joined by
Emerald Moon. A woman.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot.
She, her.
I completely blanked on your name, sorry.
My name's Emerald Moon we do the podcast together.
What?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
This episode, we're talking about the political spectrum, the old lefty-righty, how left-wing or right-wing Australian voters are and what they think the Australian political parties are and whether any of this matters whatsoever and what the fuck any of that means anyway.
How incorrect it all is. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, quickly before we do it, we should say, if you haven't already done our listener survey, please do it. Takes 5 minutes or less if you're, a quick thinker or you skip some of the questions. Most of the questions aren't mandatory. Just give us whatever thoughts you have, what kind of guests you like, what kind of episodes you like, when you want them to come out, all that jazz. It would help us a lot because then we can do more of what you like and less of what you hate, hopefully.
This is your podcast, all right? Emerald and I, we're just caretakers and we're here to make this podcast for you. Now, Emerald wrote the podcast questions, did a fantastic job. I noticed you didn't include like a definitive who is the funny one kind of question there to sort of sort that out.
I feel like that's been settled. I feel as though the listener survey has been, the reviews on Apple Podcasts, the reactions at live shows,
right,
the DMs we receive. I think it's quite clear. It's a wealth of information.
All right, so the inspiration for this episode and this topic was a tweet from our good friend Cosmaris, friend of the show.
Good friend of the show, yeah.
I mean, his politics and not politics. I will say, he's putting out a lot of interesting political data, I suppose, and I appreciate the kind of stuff that Redbridge does. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily have to agree with these takes. You absolutely do not have to hand it to him, and you can disagree with these takes, but they're doing some interesting research out there. And Cos a few weeks ago tweeted this: Our and Accent Research Next MRP examines the ideological heartbeat of every federal electorate, offering key insights into the political landscape. Good news for Labor. Most voters perceive Labor as a centrist or centre-right party, which effectively secures it the 76 seats needed to govern. This broad-based appeal positions Labor as the party closest to the ideological centre of Australian politics. So,
job done. Nice. Congratulations, Labor.
Just keep doing what you're doing, Labor. Everything's going great. You're on track. Bad news for the broader left. The numbers reveal that the left is not the majority. If Labor relied solely on the progressive left, it would only win 33 seats. Labor's ability to secure an additional 44 seats hinges on its reputation as a centrist party. This demonstrates that shifting further to the left would alienate crucial middle ground voters, ultimately costing Labor support. Then there's a few other points he makes about what this means for the coalition, and he also had a bunch of graphs in there which appear in the actual report, which we are going to go through on this episode because there is some really interesting stuff in there, even though it's all a little bit confused. What's your initial reaction to Cos's tweet there and kind of the ideas he's putting out there about Labor staying on track, lefty, righty? How do you feel about all this?
I have to approach the report with an open mind because obviously this reads very much as spin from Cos. It reads as someone trying to push a political agenda, which is that being left is a bad idea politically and it's electorally dangerous, and Labor should keep being a centre-right party because that's good, and maybe that's what I want because I'm Kosamaris. But it is like, I think the report itself is interesting. What he doesn't mention in this tweet, and maybe we'll get to, is that the identification with Labor's politics, as voters see it, doesn't necessarily translate into votes as much as the identification with the LNP does. Kind of unclear why that is, but interesting that he doesn't mention that in this tweet.
Sure. Yeah. And he will also contradict, as we'll get to in some other articles, is sort of contradicting his position too, in which he sort of suggests that Labor should do heaps more to the left, or at least should present a more an economically radical program in order to win working class voters. So it seems a little bit contradictory to me, but we'll get into that. The report is called Left, Right, Out: How Voters Perceive Their Own Politics and the Relative Positions of Political Parties in a Left-Right Ideological Space. It's a very catchy title. It's talking about how Australian voters place themselves on that spectrum from left to right, how they self-identify along that spectrum, where they place the political parties, and how that then maps onto federal electorates. We'll talk about the big sort of takeaways. There's some funny shit in here and just more evidence that everyone's ideology is absolutely confused and no one knows what the fuck they believe.
Yeah, no, that's so true.
It's very interesting, but also very confusing. But yes, what are your big picture thoughts before we jump into it onto the idea when people talk about the ideological spectrum and Australian politics? It's come up a lot. We've talked about how confused lots of people are, how woolly these terms left, right, and centrist can be.
Yeah.
What do you what are the big thoughts you think about when you think about the left-right spectrum and how useful it is?
I wish I knew whether when voters are responding to this survey, or if there are questions in the survey in any way that kind of draw the distinction between economic politics and social politics. And I would be very curious to know, when people are answering these questions, whether they're primarily thinking about whether they're socially conservative or progressive, or whether they're economically left or right. And I genuinely, I don't really know.
No, well, having read the report, I can tell you that question is not answered. And it's kind of the big messy stew, right, that everybody puts in there. And to some people, the left could be, I don't know, an annoying person they met once who told them they were using the wrong word. That's the left.
Yeah.
And that's how they're basing their entire decision on it. Some other people might have a more sophisticated understanding, but I think it's not necessarily, you might not expect the report to go into that, but a huge grain of salt that should be applied to this entire report is we're talking about people's own self-identification, and there's no meat on that bones. So therefore we can use that omission to justify all our positions and say that we're good and everything's fine.
Yeah. I will say that I am surprised that people would self-identify as right-wing, and actually is it left to right, or is it left to conservative? Because maybe people are more ready to identify as conservative. But I would be surprised. I think most people would think, I'm centrist, rather than I'm a right-wing person.
Yes. I think the big takeaway from this is that lots of people like to think of themselves as living in a sensible centre, as you and I do, right? That's where we are.
In between wrong and wrong. Correct. That's about where I sit.
We believe justice is good, but not too much.
Yeah.
You know? Democracy is nice, but let's be sensible about this.
Yeah. Equality.
Do you think that most Australians are left-wing, right-wing, centrist, confused? How do people think about that terms? Would you had to roll the gun to your head?
Yeah.
Is Australia, most Australian voters left-wing, right-wing? Go.
No. Don't know. Well, because as you're getting at, we're about to have this whole episode where we discuss this report, and I still think the report is interesting, but it's like a left-right spectrum is, if you're actually trying to use that to summarize people's politics, that's stupid. It's useless.
Yeah. And of course, everyone, even if something is perhaps outside of what would traditionally be considered to be the left tradition or the political thought that you subscribe to, if something's good, you'll of course incorporate that into your political philosophy. So I'm right wing, I believe in free markets, but Medicare is good. We should hang on to that, or whatever.
I also have a question, which is how elastic, how malleable do you think these self-identifications are
for the people themselves?
Yeah. Like, do people move around a lot, or do they generally, situate themselves somewhere kind of as part of their identity, but then issue by issue, where the parties are sitting affects like their voting and beliefs and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, also mixed into this whole soup is anti-political sentiment, the disconnect between the way politics plays out and the effect on people's lives. And if that is more and more disconnected, right? If it's more and more disconnected about who I vote for in the federal election compared to how that's going to change my life, something like, oh, I hate that guy's face, or that guy's really annoying, could well be the deciding factor in people's votes, right? If they really don't see a huge difference playing out based on the results of this election, then they could be like, oh, I'm left wing, but none of it actually matters because none of it really changes. And this guy seems annoying, so I'm going to vote against him, even though he has all the correct policy positions. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd also flag that at moments in the report, they talk about the far left and the far right, which is kind of interesting terms as well, right? There's the center, there's center left, and then there's, well, what we would call left, right? Like, but that is sometimes referred to as the far left.
Yes.
Which I think is, what do you think about that term? That seems to be, are we in the far left? Or are you on the actual left? The hard
he
left?
calls himself far left. I can't remember in what context, but like someone, that's right. When he came to visit me at a pre-poll booth and the LNP tried to approach him, he doesn't initially like necessarily look like a lefty. And I think what he said to them was, no, I'm far left.
Far left, thank you.
Yeah,
where's the far left
far
option,
left for me,
please?
thanks.
But don't you think there's something inherently, it's like a slightly derogatory term, like, or the far, obviously
so
we talk about the far right,
isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
I say yes. To me, far right is a derogatory term, but far left isn't, because I'm probably far left. So obviously the opposite is bad.
Well, actually, I think if you look at a horseshoe, they kind of end up thinking the same
kind
thing.
of come back around. Same, it's,
I don't know. Far, just, I guess maybe again, it's the centrist discourse and the focus and the fetishization of the center and the sensible center. But of course, if you're far away from what is considered to be the center, which of course we should say is a completely movable term that means different things to different people and shifts with time and geography and political context. Yeah, I still think that far people, I very rare, I think it's a rare thing that someone would self-identify it as far left.
Yeah,
far right.
He's a pretty special guy.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, I don't necessarily, I don't see a problem with identifying as far left, because I personally, and maybe this is just a me, my values, I think it's good to commit yourself to something fully. Like, if you believe in something, believe in it, go the whole hog, which is why people have probably heard me say before that centrists annoy me more than far right people. And I understand who's more dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But like, I'm probably just as likely to insult someone by calling them a centrist than I am as calling them far right.
Well, to me, the much more clarifying distinction is between liberals, left liberals, like, small L liberals.
Yeah.
People who subscribe to liberalism, which you will find lots and lots of people in the Labor Party, basically identifying as small L liberals, and socialists. That's like the actual difference, your position.
But you can't do that in a poll in Australia of normal people. It would genuinely be confusing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Damn it. Okay, the research examines the self-reported ideological position of Australian voters and how this compares with the perceived position of the Liberal and National Coalition parties, the Labor Party, the Greens, and One Nation. Thank you, Cosamaris, for not describing us as the Greens political party. I
was going to say Labor Party and the Greens. Labor political party, sounding pretty establishment there, guys. Shame.
It was conducted in November of last year. The sample size of 3,511 voters from 18 years up. Recruited to fill quotas based on age, gender, location, education, and their vote in 2022. Because of something called rim weighting,
which
the
you
sample
would know about.
size. That's why I included this. I was interested to see what you'd come up with. Rim weighting, the sample size actually becomes 2,692 people. Don't tell me what that is. I don't know. Don't ask me, rather. The margin of error is
Actually,
1.9%.
you can guess, right? Like if you're like, okay, the people on the rim are the ones on the edges,
Right.
and maybe they adjust for that or something
It's like it's a rim job. You need
to make it more
to
representative.
You need to just bring them in,
Yeah,
do a rim
they
job
lick
on the
the
sample
arse.
size, and then it's just smaller.
Mhm.
The electorate level analysis uses multi-level regression with post-stratification, MRP, which we've talked about
As we've
before,
spoken about.
which sort of assumes that voters behave in a related way to other voters with shared characteristics in similar divisions. So they do this this survey of voters, figure out the attitudes, and then kind of extrapolate that across the country, knowing what we know about the demographic data of all the various divisions.
Yeah.
So that's just the, putting it out there about the research. The key findings, which is similar to what Cos was talking about in that tweet, nearly a third of voters identify themselves in the political centre. Another third say they're right of centre, almost a quarter say they're left of centre, and 13% are not sure. The electorate sees Labor as less ideological or more moderate than other parties. And this is good for Labor geographically, with most voters perceiving their political position being closer to Labor in a majority of the seats. But the coalition is estimated to be translating ideological proximity into votes more efficiently than Labor, sort of what you were saying before.
Yeah.
The main centre-right parties are also estimated to be gaining support precisely where they need to win the next election, obtaining larger swings in Labor-held divisions that are ideologically evenly split between voters closer to its own position and Labor's. So they've got a whole bunch of these seats where people sort of say it's the same difference between my personal political position and those two major parties. And in those seats, those Labor-held seats, that's where the coalition is getting the swings, which they would argue, that's the outer suburban areas, which is exactly what they need to do to win 21 seats to gain majority government.
Yeah.
So those are the key findings. Now, again, I would just say at no point in the report are they talking about the fact or just really appreciating the fact what it means to rely entirely on the self-identification of voters, okay, or the vagueness of what that terms. Now, I say that, I guess I would also say that perhaps that doesn't matter, right? We're talking, an election is entirely composed of what people have in their heads, okay? And you can't correct their ideological positions or say, oh, you're actually left-wing. We have ABC Compass for that.
The ABC will try. All the leftists furiously sharing the political compass and asking all their relatives and friends to do it. We try.
We try and do that, yes. So, yeah, am I right there? Like, it doesn't actually matter. Even though it's an important thing to keep in mind while reading this information, this is what people think, and elections are based on what voters actually think.
It depends what you're trying to take out of this, right? Like, if you are a political strategist working in a political party and you're reading this because you want to form policy that most closely reflects the electorate's wishes and desires and beliefs, then it kind of does matter, and you should keep in mind the like vagaries and unreliability of this kind of self-identification and this kind of spectrum.
Yeah.
But if you are just someone who is interested in how to present things or what is a likely outcome in the federal election, then maybe it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah. Well, with a complete absence of any policy discussion whatsoever in this report, and again, maybe that's not what the report is setting out to do, but again, that's important to keep in mind. And it's particularly important when we get to what is to be done, or the analysis, people citing this particular report and saying, see, we should be more, Labor shouldn't move any further to the left and should appeal to the right, and the whole country is made up of centrists, and so you can't fucking do anything. That's important to keep in mind, I suppose. The report is freely available, by the way. We'll put the link in the show notes if people want to read along, if you really want to dive into the appendix of the methodology. And I know some of you freaks do, then fucking go for it.
They've already read
it. Yes, right. Thank you for doing the required reading for this Patreon episode. I guess the other thing I'd say is that this idea about like Labor being less ideological or more moderate, more in the centre. And I want to raise a few question marks about this idea that being in the centre, therefore, means that you're free from ideology, you're more moderate, and you're more practical or pragmatic.
So when they say voters view them as less ideological, that's purely just about how many voters place them in the centre.
That's the
not a separate
interpretation of
question.
the report.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. I don't agree with that.
Right, this is the teal pitch, right? Like, we don't believe in ideology. We believe in sensible solutions to problems, and we'll take it an issue by issue basis. When in fact, that's not actually what they believe, and they do have an ideology. It's just that they're not particularly aware of it or particularly forthcoming.
Centrism
or
is
believe
such a
that it
fucking
exists.
ideology. It's so
Yes.
ideological. Yeah.
And I suppose, yes, this presentation of the center being like, well, I'm in the center, which means that I'm not too fiercely wedded to being left wing or right wing. And so if something comes
Yes.
up and it's a little bit right wing, a solution to a problem is a little bit right wing, but I think it's a good solution, then I'm prepared to entertain that.
But people also, I think, do that where, like, they probably are, what's the word, lumping in together political ideology and political parties in Australia in this. One thing that I was interested in was the graph of undecided people who are either undecided or will not vote. And it is like 100, it is dead center. Like, the graph is just a mountain, just goes up at the center and down at the sides. And I was like, if that included anti-politics people, though, and it were accurate, you would think that it would go the opposite way. Like, it would include a lot of people quite far to the left and a lot of people quite far to the right who don't feel represented by the current spectrum of, like, by the major parties necessarily. But perhaps people are just like, well, I'm a swing voter. I'm not left or right, i.e. I'm not Liberal or Labor.
Right, yes. Which, again, if we could understand the psychology of the swing voter. But I guess, obviously, there's lots of people who exist in that, and there's reasons why.
Swing voters listening in, right in.
You think there are swing voters who are patrons of serious
Tom,
danger?
I'm making jokes.
Oh, I don't get jokes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, funny one.
All right, so we'll move through this pretty quickly, but sort of the report breaks down into a couple of sections. Okay, first of all, how voters perceive themselves. As we've discussed, based on these survey results, a third of the electorate, about 31%, view themselves as being in the political centre. Another third are right of centre, quarter left of centre, 13% not able to place themselves on a left-right ideological scale.
I thought more people would be like, I'm not sure.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, again, not sure is that, and how many people in the center is people who probably should have said they're not sure, but like the idea of being in the center. Also, I think if you don't know, then you are probably in this. You're probably in the center. I don't know.
No,
no one should be in the center. Get the fuck out of the center, you 31%, you weirdos. So that breaks down to 9% of the far left or hard left or actual left, 14% in the centre left, 31% in the centre, 19% centre right, 14% far right, and 13% don't know. But the point that the report wants to make is based on this self-identification, right-leaning voters outnumber those on the left by 10%. Is that surprising to you? Is this definitive proof that we do live in a right-wing country? What the left always says whenever we lose an election? It's like, fuck this country.
I think, like I said, I was a little bit surprised that many people identified it as right, being on the right. Genuinely. I have to say I was surprised by that.
Don't you think young people on the right are much more likely to say they're right than, say, conservative? Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that's a wild swing, but
I don't know. I mean, there is an age breakdown, and younger people still do trend left.
Yes,
but interestingly, the age breakdown only, the youngest age bracket is 18 to 34, and I think that's a very wide bracket. And it would be interesting to look at the particular, like the Zoomers, and see where they sit, and particularly Zoomer boys and men.
Yeah. But again, I read these results and my mind is cast back to polling on specific issues and things like the stage 3 tax cuts, not finding, a majority of coalition voters being against winding back the stage 3 tax cuts, the polling on privatization, like these when you actually talk about actual issues. So all these people say, there are all these center right people who say they're on the right. They go, well, actually, on an issue by issue basis, when you actually talk about things that affect their lives, it's certainly not as simple as saying all these right-wing people, all these people who identify as being on the right would oppose all these kind of policies that people are running.
Do you think, again, I come back to this question, do you think most people are answering this on the basis of their social politics rather than fiscal?
Yeah. I mean, again, that's kind of hard to say. Certainly, I think the default for your average lefty is a focus on social justice. I think your average right-wing person, get the government out of my life, low taxes, free enterprise, the government is a bit shit. Perhaps it actually breaks down those two.
It's the wokeness. I don't know why they're like this.
Right.
Yes, I do believe in, family and maybe sometimes conservative values. I don't know.
The self-reported ideology is strongly associated with vote intention. More than half of coalition voters, 53%, place themselves on the right. Conversely, 38% of Labor voters see themselves as being on the left, as do 60% of Greens voters.
That's right, baby.
We know who we are, y'all.
It is stark because the Labor, I suppose there is a fairly significant chunk of people who identify as centre-left for Labor.
Yes.
But it's almost the same, the proportion of people who identify as in the centre is 31% of coalition voters and 32% of Labor voters.
Yes.
So that's interesting.
Yes.
Whereas for the Greens, 40% left, proper left, far left, 20% centre left, and only 23% in the centre. And then when you get on the right, it is tiny.
What do you think the average Labor voter's relationship is with being on the left? Like, do you think there are lots of Labor supporters out there who are like, oh, I don't know about the left, but maybe they associate left with more social, cultural wokeness, perhaps. But they sort of say, well, yeah, I'm part of my union, or I think, the average working man is good.
Well, I think the people who are involved in the Labor Party would identify as being on the left, like much more commonly. But the average Joe who tends to vote Labor might be where that big centre chunk is coming from.
I really don't. I very rarely hear anyone associated with the Labor Party talk about being on the left or being proudly
What?
left-wing.
What are you talking about?
Seriously.
They always think they're the left. Even the right faction of the Labor Party would still think they're on the left of politics.
In the parliamentary Labor Party? No, we'll think they're on the left of politics, but would they campaign on things around and proudly subscribe themselves to a left tradition? Like literally, I'm talking about literally using the word left.
Yes, I actually think so, because I think we're the party of unions. We organise rallies. We stand up for women's rights. We wanted women to vote and have abortions, except the Catholics among us, maybe. But I think there is that strong belief among and maybe maybe you're drawing a distinction between, as you say, the Labor caucus and the higher ups, as opposed to the rank and file members of the Labor Party. But I feel like that's the problem. That's the Labor delusion, is that it is sold to their members as the left party and that we are on the left and we're a left movement while not acting in a way that's consistent with left politics.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, you've still got more Labor voters saying they're either centre-left or left than Labor voters saying they're in the centre, which is kind of interesting. But there you go. Some other findings here. Self-reported ideology is also strongly associated with age, religion, asset ownership, and education. Conservatism increases with age. Now, again, if you look at the age breakdown, yes, older people who are alive now are more conservative than young people who are alive now. But as lots of other evidence is showing, millennials, for example, are a generation that are remaining with the left as they're getting older because they ain't got no shit. The non-religious are much more likely to identify as being on the left, not surprising there, less likely to identify themselves as being conservative than the religious. Those who own more assets, including the home in which they live, are more likely to identify as conservative. The university educated are more likely to identify as being on the left.
Yeah, fairly unsurprising stuff. Like, pretty stark that home ownership won. Certainly, like, yeah, in terms of the left, they've got 16%, whereas mortgage holders and owns outright are both 7% and 6%. I thought it was interesting, the income one, because it doesn't change that much. In fact, it does this kind of bounce back where it's like, I was looking, I think when people say prefer not to say that they're rich, don't you? Because there's a prefer not to say band here.
Yeah.
And it's the most conservative. And I just reckon, I don't know.
My husband and I would prefer not to
it's
disclose
rather
our
gauche.
income.
We do not discuss.
But we're very normal and we work very hard.
Yeah.
Some other
Yeah, I
takeaways
don't
here.
know.
I thought these were funny. 6% of coalition voters put themselves on the centre left. The left vote for the coalition doesn't exist. It's clearly negligible, but there are coalition voters out there who think of themselves as being on the centre left. For Greens voters, 40% on the left, 20% on the centre left. 23% of Greens voters are in the sensible centre. 7% are centre right, and 3% are on the right.
Who are you?
Good luck to you.
Are you
Who are
listening?
you? Call in.
Legalize cannabis likers. Surely.
7% don't know. We actually have the lowest don't know vote of all the parties, which I thought was
that
sort of
doesn't
interesting.
surprise.
So there you go. Labour, 12% on the left, as you say, 26% centre left, 32% in the centre, 13% centre right, 5% right, and 12% don't know, which is kind of an interesting breakdown there too. So then we go geographical breakdown. The research does a geographical distribution of the ideology using the MRP methodology. Unsurprisingly, the electorates covering the inner cities of the major metropolitan areas tend to contain more left-of-centre voters than elsewhere, although there are also significant clusters along the New South Wales coast. Newcastle, Cunningham, covering much of Wollongong, and Richmond, Mandy Nolan, the state's north coast, with these three seats being three of the most left-leaning in the country. Rural electorates tend to be the most conservative, and electorates in Queensland tend to be more conservative. The more novel finding is that there are more seats where voters who place their politics on the right outnumber those who identify as being on the left. This is consistent with the finding above that more voters place themselves on the right than the left. Now, I'm going to ask you again here.
Yeah.
Okay, so like, yes, the messiness of self-identification. Yes, the wooliness of these terms. Yes, people might be thinking about lots of things. But is this another sort of piece of evidence that Australia is perhaps more actually conservative, actually more right-wing than we might have previously thought about?
Well, but isn't that – I thought that what you were just reading out was specifically for electoral analysis, right? Like, that's more to point out that using – the current electoral boundaries, like division by division, the conservative side of politics would win more seats. The coalition wins more seats, basically, right?
Well, not necessarily the coalition wins more seats, but there are more in all these seats. There are more seats in which there's a majority of people who identify as being on the right than on the left.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily that's dividing things by seats, which isn't an even distribution, which is why we have a Senate, right? Because then that creates a more proportional.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the breakdown, in New South Wales, there are 5 seats with more voters on the left than the right. And again, you can look it up. The graphs in the report are pretty stark, right? There's a graph with a line down the middle and then a whole bunch of seats. And in every state and territory, basically, the majority, most of those dots that represent a seat are on the right side of that line. And there are very few seats that appear on the left where voters who identify as being on the left are in the majority. Those seats are Richmond, Cunningham, Newcastle, Grayndler, and Sydney. Again, Grayndler and Sydney, let's have those seats, please. Can we just have those seats?
Don't we talk about entitlement, being entitled to seats? I think
but I just where are all these left-wing people living in the seat of Sydney who think that Tanya Plibersek is the best choice?
God,
anyway,
yeah.
Maybe that's on us.
Yeah.
In Victoria, there are 7 seats with more left-wing voters than right-wing voters. Maribyrnong, Bill Shorten's former seat, as he's leaving. Corio, which is kind of crazy.
Where is that?
Richard Miles' seat, who's from the Labor right.
Oh, okay.
Fraser, which is my seat. McNamara, Cooper, Melbourne, and Wills.
Yeah.
Those are the lefty seats. In Queensland, just 3 seats there where there are more left-wing voters than right-wings.
And they're not the ones you think.
Lily, Moreton and Griffin.
Mm.
Yes.
Now, this is really interesting. Like Moreton particularly, so Griffith is the most most left-wing, and Moreton right after that, which we interviewed Rima Nagy on the show, and Moreton was kind of identified as the next potential like growth seat for the Greens at a federal level. And Lily, a lot of people would say, is kind of not far behind that. What's interesting on this is how more to the right voters in Ryan and Brisbane self-identify than a bunch of other seats that are Labor-held seats. Like these are a bunch of the few. You look at where the Greens, like where Melbourne is, the only other Greens seat in the country, and it is pretty significantly on the left. It's got to be one of the furthest left in these graphs.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ryan and Brisbane, 2 Greens-held seats, are notionally conservative.
Yes. Which, again, and I think the report is acknowledging the fact that there are seats in which the majority of people might identify as right-wing, but that doesn't mean that the coalition automatically gets those seats. It doesn't quite work out that way. In fact, Labor holds a whole bunch of these seats, obviously, where there is a greater number of people who identify as a right. But again, the point of the whole report is there are a whole bunch of people who might identify themselves as being on the right who are still prepared to vote for Labor and indeed the Greens.
Well, you know what's interesting about this as well is it would kind of lend credence to the argument that the Greens made, which is that the ground campaign and the campaign that was actually run in Queensland seats like Ryan, Brisbane and Griffith made a big difference, because remembering that this seat stratification isn't actually seat polling. It's not necessarily saying that the results in these seats were more people identify as this. It's using the nationwide sample and then it maps it based on demographics to say that this seat should have been this level of conservatism based on those shared characteristics. But as we know, that wasn't the case. And so you have to wonder, is that because they were door knocked? They, ran these they offered mutual aid during the floods. They had council and state representatives who demonstrated what Greens can do. I don't know what the explanation is, and I have to say, obviously we don't know because we ran back big campaigns in the state election and it didn't necessarily work. But I struggle to know what the explanation is for this, unless we can look at an equivalent poll and report from 2022, which is significantly different. I don't know if that exists.
Well, again, to me, it just reminds us that, again, the strength, the level of commitment that people would have to these political ideologies really must be brought into question, or at least might not tell you, a heck of a lot about their voting intention. I mean, you've told stories so many times of door knocking and swinging. People had previously voted One Nation to the Greens when you started talking about material policies that would make their lives better, that direct their anger at things like the banks or massive corporations or really rich people and say, these people are getting away with murder or you're getting screwed. That same dissatisfaction previously led you to vote for Pauline Hanson. Here's why. We recognize your frustration and we actually think that the solution is voting for the Greens.
You know what else can I just very quickly, before we move on from these graphs, if anyone's looking at the report, but the other cool thing about this graph for Queensland is the Kennedy stripe. The way, for anyone who's not looking at this, how do I describe it? It's got like the dot for the middle of the results based on the polling and then the MRP, and it's got the colour, which indicates who it's currently held by. Kennedy, obviously. What's his name? What's his name?
Bob Katter.
Bob Katter, thank you. I know who is the member for Kennedy, everyone, for the record. But anyway, this line is so far stretched out. It's more stretched out than the rest, and it goes like pretty significantly far to the right, and it also stretches into the left. I find that interesting.
I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of like people talking about the Nationals being a little bit more to the left. Maybe that's the agrarian socialists coming through. I don't know.
Well, people do see it. That's what people say the Katters are. Yeah.
Yeah. Just briefly, 2 other Greens target seats of the 2025 election that we've talked about. Sturt in South Australia, which has been listed by Adam Band, that has more right-wing voters, more people that identify as right-wing than left-wing. which you would think that's a long-held Liberal seat that the Greens are trying to win. And Perth in WA, another target seat in another state. There are more left-wing voters there. That's currently held by Labor, by Patrick Gorman. So there you go. I mean, I guess the target seats we're talking about would sort of make sense. But also the picture that, yes, just because there are, according to this report, electorates in which there are more people who identify as the right than the left doesn't mean that the Greens can't win, for God's sake.
Yeah, I mean, Brisbane and Ryan, you could look at this graph 3 years ago and go, oh, well, of course they are on the right. They're Liberal-held seats. The seat of Ryan has never been won by anyone but the Liberal Party at a general election. Until. All
right, now this is what voters perceive, how the voters perceive the parties on the left-right spectrum, which is kind of interesting. So this is what all voters think about these various political parties. When it comes to Labor, 51% of voters put Labor on the left, 23% on the far left. 18% put them in the centre, 20% of voters put Labor on the right. For the Liberals, 13% of people put the Liberals on the left. Some real salty Conservatives, I assume, will make up that number in there somewhere. Bloody Malcolm Turnbull, fucking left-wing snowflake. 14% put the Liberals in the centre, and the right, 62% of voters identify the Liberals as being on the right in the spectrum. That's 34% far right. So that's more on the far right, rather than the centre right. Isn't that right? You know what I mean? Yes. More 28% of people put the Liberal Party on the centre right. 34% put them on the far right, the real right.
It does just say right.
I know. For the Nationals, 12% put the Nationals on the left, 17% put the Nationals in the centre, 54% put them on the right. For the Greens, 60% of all voters say that the Greens are on the left, 42% left, 18% centre-left. 12% of voters put us in the centre, the sensible centre. Maybe that's all the people who vote for us. I don't know. And 14% of all voters put the Greens on the right. Discuss.
Who's that? The Victorian Socialists.
Famously representing 40% of the country.
I guess, presumably you would be expecting or hoping. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Your graph of where voters see you to kind of match up with the self-identification of your voters, right? And the Greens sort of does, except the Greens voters identified as slightly more left overall than they believe the Greens to be.
Yes. God, it gets tricky, doesn't it? Because you've got to keep in mind Greens voters and the parties think. And how people identify.
Yeah.
And of course, people that do not like the Greens will put them on the left, even though we think that's a good thing because we like the left. But the people who hate the Greens will be like, yes, of course the Greens are on the far left, and that is very bad, you see.
Well, it's true that it's 42% or something of respondents say that they think the Greens are on the left, the far left, whereas only 40% of Greens voters said they're on the left. Is that right? Yeah. So slight difference, but not that much really.
And then we get the breakdown. This is the juicy, bitchy stuff. Here we get to see what specific voters think of the parties, okay? So when it comes to the Liberals, 13% of coalition voters think the Liberal Party is on the left. 14% of Labor voters think the coalition is on the left. 9% of Greens voters think the Liberal Party is on the left. Mm-hmm. So again, who is that person? What's that person? I'm going to vote for the Greens. I really don't
know.
But I also think the Liberals are on the left.
Yeah.
What? One Nation, 11. I've just plucked out the funniest or most remarkable thoughts here. 11% of Greens voters think that One Nation is on the left.
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me.
What are they going for there? She's
she wants to legalize
populist?
Cannabis. She's a populist. What are the other things?
She's not on board cannabis, is she?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Pretty sure.
Sorry, I missed that. No,
I think so.
maybe.
Just random shit like that, you know?
When it comes to Labor, 60% of coalition voters think Labor is on the left. 34% of them think that Labor's on the left, the far left. 51% of Labor voters think Labor is on the left. 35% of them think Labor's on the centre left. 19% of Labor voters think Labor is in the centre. 23% of Labor voters think they're on the right.
Okay.
So more Labor voters think Labor's on the right than in the centre.
What about on the left?
51% of Labor voters think that Labor's on the left.
Yeah.
Yeah, the majority, the vast majority, which sort of makes sense. 40% of Greens voters think Labor are on the left, 23% in the centre, and 28% on the right. So there you go. Think about that. Put all that together.
So Labor, blah, 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 Greens. Yeah, Greens have a vastly different view of the Labor Party to everyone else in terms of how right-wing they are.
Yes, 28%. That would be the highest proportion of people who say that Labor is on the right. Yes. And finally, when it comes to the Greens, 64% of coalition voters think the Greens are on the left. 48%, almost half of coalition voters think we're on the far left, as left as you can go. 13% of coalition voters put the Greens on the right. 56% of Labor voters put the Greens on the left. 34% of them, more than a third, think that we're far left. 15% of Labor voters put the Greens in the centre. 17% put us on the right. 17% of Labor voters think the Greens are on the right.
Yeah.
Is that the tree Tory thing?
Tories. But this is interesting, what the Greens think. So 73% of Greens voters put the Greens on the left. And I note that even the far left, as you've been calling it, or just left as it's identified here, more Greens put Greens there than even the coalition. And I would have thought, that coalition voters would have been like, they're all far left. But still 6% of Greens voters think that the Greens are in the centre and 14% say that they are on the right. Kind of surprised that more don't think they're in the centre.
Yeah. Again, the messiness of these terms I would consider that to be an insult. Other people think, well, being in the centre means that you're reasonable. The Richard D. Natale approach, that we represent mainstream Australia, and that, things like bringing things back into public ownership, these are actually very, bog standard popular policy positions to have that you would find a majority of Australians agreeing to. Therefore, surely that puts you in the centre somewhat, no? But I mean, is it a sign of is it strong branding for everyone to say it? And does this sort of put to bed the idea that, that people would sign up to the tree Tory pejorative description of the Greens?
Yeah,
it's quite a niche critique, isn't it? That the Greens aren't actually left wing.
That's such a hack. Yeah. That's such a small number of Labor hacks who would genuinely try to argue that the Greens are right wing, and they're really only doing it for each other. Yeah.
Yes, and to make themselves feel better about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, where voters perceive the parties to be relative to them, that is like how close these parties are to where they sort of sit. This was sort of interesting, I thought. When it comes to One Nation, 40% of coalition voters think that One Nation are in a similar political position to them. 40% of coalition voters think, One Nation, we're pretty close. We're not far from them. 22% of Labor voters, 10% of Greens voters. What the hell? When it comes to Liberals, 27% of Labor voters think the Liberals are in a similar position to them. 20% of the Greens voters think they're similar. Nationals, 23% of Greens voters think the Nationals are in a similar position to them. Okay. 57% of Labor voters think that they're in a similar position to Labor. So what's that? That's 43% of people who vote for the Labor Party don't think the Labor Party is close to their political position.
Well, but I mean, we've got the same, 57% of Greens voters think that the Greens are in a similar position to them.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
26% think they are a bit to the left.
Yeah.
which is more than Labor. And so what is that, 57% of Labor voters think Labor's a bit to the right? Whereas, yes, for the Greens, it's only 17%.
Yeah. 21% of coalition voters think the Greens are in a similar position to them. All right. Then fucking vote for us, guys.
Come on over, I guess.
Yeah, stop being a coalition voter. 40% of Labor voters think the Greens are in a similar position to them. 44% think we're to the left. 16% think we're to their right. Anyway, look, this might be difficult to listen to sort of keep track.
Yeah, I was going to say, this might start to just sound like a jumble of numbers. Should we sing a song? Tom,
take a step to the left.
Take a step to the right.
To the right.
Put your hands on your hips.
Again, I was reading this and I was thinking, well, it's interesting how much this contrasts with something like ABC Compass, right? When you ask people about their actual political beliefs on issues then they map that onto the political party, as opposed to this vague amorphous terms about are you left, centre, right, and then where do you put the parties in there. But like, no, what do you actually think? Like, what are what things do you want people to do? Let's leave those terms aside. Like, we can let political scientists let you know, I guess, where you land on this kind of spectrum. But it's like, what do you actually want? How do you think Australia should change? What do you think's wrong with our current society? And how should we go about fixing it? All right, we'll come to the end. I mean, again, people can read the report if they like, and the report sort of then goes on to sort of draw out the electoral ramifications of this data. I don't know what Samaras wants, because we heard in that tweet at the start, he was saying shifting further to the left will alienate centrist voters and ultimately cost Labor votes. Okay. Then he gives a quote in Matthew Nott's piece, Trudeau, Biden and Ardern are done. What's eating the global left, which is not worth your time reading. It's quite a silly article in my personal opinion. But we got this quote. Samaras says the left needs to refashion itself as a force for populist disruption rather than as a defender of the status quo. The left in general has taken its eye off its number one priority in the 20th century, which was the economic empowerment of low-income constituencies. Progressive centre-left parties, including in Australia, need to become more radical on the economic front. Otherwise, they will suffer the consequences we are seeing around the world.
Okay. I've been thinking about this. Have been thinking about there is a tension between the idea that to be successful as an electoral project,
yes,
you need to have broad appeal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is also people want to vote for something that represents them. And also maybe people want to feel a bit special. And I wonder if like part of the appeal of the Greens is that thing of being like, I'm not like other people. I'm not, I don't hold the same views as everyone else. We're not all in this together. Actually, I think my racist uncle fucking sucks. And I want to vote for someone who is not like him. Like, I've been thinking about this thing, and I think there is a bit of that, particularly among like the Greens base. So this thing of trying to be more broadly popular, and to do that, casting yourself as just like the same as the majority has a problem there. I'm not saying necessarily abandon it. It's just something that I've been thinking about. But I wonder if he's kind of getting at something similar here, that it's like situating yourself as a fighter for a minority in a way, or a fighter for a particular group, rather than just we're for everyone. Like, everyone wants the same thing at the end of the day, except for maybe this handful of evil billionaires. Everyone wants the same thing. Like, maybe you need to be like, no, we are for a particular group of people, and are you with us? Then vote for us.
Sure. Well, again, I'm sympathetic to this general approach, right? We've talked about this a lot on the show. If the argument coming from the likes of Samaras, the likes of Nick Dierenforth, who also wrote this god-awful piece predicting the political trends for 2025, in which he says that the Greens are going backwards, by the way, because of course we're evil and anti-Semitic. We'll wait and see. If they win a seat like Will's, it will be Pyrrhic, crueling hopes elsewhere for generations. Let's come back and see how Nick's predictions sort of play out in 2025. But if the pitch is less of the identity stuff, less of the social issue stuff, get back to basics, get back to issues of class and economic justice, and that's what the left should be about, I'm like, I'm sympathetic to that in terms of an emphasis, not throwing out, of course, people's civil rights or backing away from those necessarily, but articulating a clear case that focuses on, transformative class-based politics. I think that's a good thing for the left to do, sure. But then you get to it like, but what is the actual policy? What is the radical economic policy that Kosamaris is behind or Nick Durenfeld is behind? Like it just seems to melt away. And they can't like seem to articulate exactly what it is. Like, are you talking about taxing the rich? Are you talking about taking anything back into public hands? Are you talking about expanding the welfare state, like bringing dental into Medicare, for example? Like, what is it other than like, okay, let's be less woke and let's talk about class? What do you want to? Do you want unions to be able to strike more? Do you want like what the fuck do you want?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, reading this again, it is very unclear and actually probably not related to the kind of point that I was, or the, musings that I was just raising, because first of all, the sentence says, Morris says the left. It's unclear whether he's talking about the left or the center left or even just like Labor. Says the left needs to refashion itself as a force for populist disruption.
Yeah.
Is the emphasis on, like, rather than as a defender of the status quo, are you emphasizing the disruption part of that, or is it about the populism part of it? And then he goes on to talk about, the economic issues. But as you say, what do you mean? And have the Greens not been doing that for the last at least 5 years? That's the whole point, is the focus on populist disruption and left economic policies. So who are you talking about that the left needs to do this?
Yeah. And look, I think to Samaris's credit, he is consistent in that the same way he would dismiss lots of the Greens as like university educated, middle class, out of touch people, he will apply that same critique to the Labor Party, right? And he will point out the fact that Labor in many ways has lost connection to its union roots and its, trade unions and stuff. And, there are a whole bunch of it's becoming the party of the university educated. So I think he has that broader critique of the left, including both Labor and the Greens, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I'm just like, come on, like, what are the fucking policies? You want economically radical? Okay, and I guess none of the Greens policies are good enough or whatever. Like what are you talking about? Because all it just seems to be is like these contradicting messages of we can't go too far left, but then we also need to be economically radical because the status quo sucks.
Does he
and
offer?
It's like, yes, the left have associated themselves with the establishment. Well, at the moment, the Labor Party is in government, which is pretty establishmenty in my view, but.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't follow Kosamaris's commentary that much. Does he offer particular takes on like different Greens MPs?
I've seen one or two posts in which he gives credit to the Greens when they're doing good stuff. I think he's like broadly.
What does he see as good stuff?
So like Max's work on identifying the renter class as like an exploited class that should recognize themselves as a class, and the campaigning that Max has done around that, I think he's given credit to. Yeah, so you'd have to give it up for that. He's been terrible on Israel-Palestine in particular. He's been truly, truly awful.
Right. So he's just saying stop talking about Palestine. Is it as simple as that?
Probably.
Yeah, okay. That's boring.
Yeah. Look, the last thing I wanted to say is that, again, as you mentioned before, this meme in Australian politics is like Australian politics, elections are won from the centre and you need to be in the sensible centre. The term centre and the centrist is so amorphous and meaningless, and so many different people seem to identify with it. There is something inherent that makes you feel good about saying that you might be in the centre, which again I think is sort of a factor that's that this report doesn't really reckon with, the idea that lots of people view it as a plus or as a worthy attribute to identify as a centrist person. But I would be much more sympathetic to the view that Australians are overwhelmingly pragmatic and non-ideological. That is, they're not particularly, the vast majority of voters aren't necessarily fully invested in these questions of political ideology, but you put something before them. Do you like privatization or do you think it sucks? Yes. Do you think rich people have too much money and that should be spent on health and education? Yes. And those kind of good ideas are much more likely to appeal and to cut through. And also we should remember that the centre is so woolly and so vague and often so lacking in principles that clinging to the center produces a political party that people don't know what you fucking stand for and what you believe in. And I think that's really what people want, is for someone to articulate a vision and have commitments and stick to them, you know?
Well, there are a couple of ways you could approach it, right? You can be like, I know what the center means. It means not standing for anything and kind of just status quo. And so to align ourselves with this group of voters, we need to do more of that. Or you can go, people want to feel that they are supporting sensible policies, and that's what they mean by identifying as centrist. And so we need to represent our platform as sensible, as pragmatic, as realistic, as, the common sense choice.
Yes.
And I think that is something that's worthwhile trying to do.
Yes. Well, if you want a fun night, you can read Left, Right, Out, the research report from Redbridge, and Accent if you so wish, or you've listened to this podcast.
It's mostly graphs, so it is fun.
Yeah, that's true. It's 60 pages, but you actually get through it pretty quick.
Yeah. Thank you for subscribing to the podcast on Patreon. We really appreciate it. Mike appreciates it. We can only run this show because of you. If you want to help us even more, please fill out the survey and maybe mention the show to a friend or share our stuff on social media. But being a Patreon subscriber is honestly more than enough. So thank you. Oh, Tom's lights have gone out. Good night, I guess.
Oh, gosh. Oh, sorry. The sun has set over the course of our conversation. And now the only thing lighting my face is, the screen. Oh, that's
the screen. It's, okay. All right. Time to go. Bye.
Bye.
Serious danger to Australia.